The story of Esther, a tale of courage and providence. Once, in the mighty Persian Empire, there was a king named Xerxes, who ruled over an enormous kingdom that stretched from India to Ethiopia. King Xerxes was known for his lavish banquets, and one day he decided to host a grand feast that would last for many days. At the height of the celebration, he ordered his queen, Vashti, to appear before him and his guests to show off her beauty. However, Vashti refused to obey the king's command, and her defiance angered Xerxes. The king, humiliated by Vashti's refusal, consulted his advisors, and they suggested that she be removed from her royal position. A decree was issued, and Vashti was banished from the palace. The king then sought a new queen, and his officials began a search throughout the empire for the most beautiful young women. Among the women chosen to appear before the king was a young Jewish woman named Esther. Esther was an orphan, raised by her older cousin, Mordecai, who worked in the king's palace as a servant. Though she was beautiful and favored by all who saw her, Esther kept her Jewish identity secret, as Mordecai had instructed her to do. When Esther was brought before King Xerxes, he was immediately taken with her beauty and charm. After a period of preparation, Esther was crowned as the new queen of Persia. She moved into the palace, but her life was not without challenges. She kept her Jewish identity hidden, as her cousin Mordecai had advised. One day, Mordecai, who had a position at the king's gate, overheard a plot to assassinate the king. Two of the king's officers had planned to kill Xerxes, but Mordecai revealed the plot to Queen Esther, who told the king in Mordecai's name. The plot was thwarted, and Mordecai's loyalty to the king was recorded in the royal records. Meanwhile, a man named Haman, who had been elevated to a high position by the king, became filled with pride. He demanded that everyone in the palace bow before him, but Mordecai, who was a devout Jew, refused to bow. This infuriated Haman, and he plotted not only to punish Mordecai but to annihilate all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Haman cast lots, called Pur, to choose the day of the massacre, and the date was set for the 13th of Adar. When Mordecai learned of Haman's plan, he tore his clothes in mourning and put on sackcloth and ashes. He sent word to Esther, urging her to approach the king on behalf of the Jewish people and plead for their lives. Esther, however, knew that anyone who entered the king's presence without being summoned could be put to death, unless the king extended his golden scepter to spare their lives. She was afraid, for she had not been summoned by the king for 30 days. But Mordecai sent a message to Esther, saying, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther, after hearing these words, decided to act. She sent a message to Mordecai saying, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." After 3 days of fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and approached the king. When Xerxes saw her standing in the court, he extended his golden scepter to her, sparing her life. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Haman was invited to the banquet, and at the feast King Xerxes again asked Esther what her request was. Esther responded, "My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman, though pleased by the honor of being invited to the queen's banquet, was still filled with rage toward Mordecai, who had refused to bow before him. As he left the palace, he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and once again, Mordecai refused to bow. This only fueled Haman's anger, and he decided to build a gallows to have Mordecai hanged. That night, the king could not sleep. He asked for the royal records to be read to him, and as the scrolls were read, the king learned that Mordecai had uncovered the plot to assassinate him. The king asked, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" The king's attendants answered, "Nothing has been done for him." The king then asked, "Who is in the court?" Haman had just entered the outer court to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. The king's attendants replied, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. Haman entered, and the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Thinking the king was speaking of him, Haman replied, "For the man the king delights to honor, let them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" The king said to Haman, "Quick, take the robe and the horse. Do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Haman, humiliated, had no choice but to obey. He led Mordecai through the streets of the city, proclaiming the king's praises as he had done for Haman in his fantasy. The next day, Esther invited the king and Haman to another banquet. This time, she finally revealed her true identity as a Jew and exposed Haman's plot to annihilate her people. King Xerxes was furious and demanded that Haman be executed. The gallows Haman had built for Mordecai were used to hang him instead. The king issued a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. On the 13th of Adar, the day that had been set for their destruction, the Jews triumphed over their foes. Mordecai was elevated to a position of power, and Esther was honored for her bravery. The Jews celebrated their victory with feasting and joy, and the event became an annual celebration known as Purim. Esther's courage, faith, and willingness to risk her life for her people saved the Jewish nation from destruction. Her story is one of divine providence, showing that even in the darkest of times, God's plans prevail, and He uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things.